Hello, everyone. This is Roger Capello bringing you My Week at the Club, episode number 70, and this is a special edition. After a hiatus here of about 2.5 months or so, where I haven't, or probably closer to 3 months, that I haven't actually been putting out any videos, and it's a sort of a chance circumstance that got me to do it. Last night we had a team match between the mwatc Chess Club and Billerica Chess Club. And I was on board two, paired against a fellow named Joe Kelly. And I'll give you that game shortly. It was an interesting game. Before the game started, Joe and I were talking, and he remarked that he had seen a few of my videos and enjoyed them. And this was a guy I didn't even know, and that was made me feel better about actually producing these things, that they're getting watched by people out there. So, kind of in the category of no deed goes unpunished, I'm going to scrutinize my game with Joe last night. But before I do, I wanted to talk a little bit about an astronomy topic that I just ran across recently. I was reading a book about the ends of the world by Peter Brannan, and it's about all the extinction, no, not all, the five major extinction events that have happened in the last 500 million years. And in the process of reading that, I became aware of an astronomical phenomenon that I hadn't heard about before. And that's a thing called the Ordovician meteor event, or the Great Ordovician meteor event. Took place during the Ordovician period, which was back about 400 this happened about 468 million years ago, but the Ordovician went about 50 million years surrounding that time. And what happened is that there was a large collision between an asteroid of probably at least 100 kilometers in diameter and another asteroid somewhere out in the asteroid belt, which then showered the Earth with pieces of the meteorite, and is still doing so up to this day. It causes a kind of chondrite called kind of meteorite called an elchondrite, which is chondrites are sort of or low iron content meteors that have little nodules in them that look different in nature than some of the meteorites that you're maybe used to seeing. And they still are very common, but it turns out if you look back at the geological layers in the Earth, that there was a period of time there right in the about 465 million years ago, which is an awfully long time, but it's only 10% of the age of the Earth. That is, 90% of the Earth's lifetime was before then. So this is the last 10% of the age of the Earth. But 450 million years ago in the Ordovician, there were these little chondrites that were falling down on the Earth that they've found in the geological record, in the rock layers, in which they've been able to date quite well. And by looking at isotopic abundances of different gases that are trapped in the meteorites, they can figure out how long those meteorites actually spent as small objects traveling through space. It turns out when they do travel through space, they get hit by cosmic rays, and that can change the isotopic abundances. That doesn't happen when they're a big meteorite because they're protected by the rock. And then once they land on the Earth, then they're also protected by the Earth's atmosphere. So it's just during that period of travel. And so working backward, they can date the age of that layer of rock, and then the short period of travel, which is only a million or 2 million years, something like that it took for the rocks to fall down to the Earth. They can figure out when this meteor event happened. And it turns out it's not just small little meteorites like the ones found in Sweden, but there are actually some fairly large craters, 20, 30, 40 kilometers in diameter, spread around the Earth, some in Scandinavia and some in the US, in Wisconsin and Arkansas and so on, where big chunks of this thing fell down. And there is a theory that's somewhat speculative, but it's interesting nonetheless, that another event in the Ordovician, the Great Ordovician biodiversity event, where there was an explosion of species in the fossil record, that lots and lots of new species were developed, have been tied to just about exactly the same epoch as this peppering by these smaller meteorites. And the thought is that these meteorites actually helped with biodiversity by coming to ground, sterilizing a patch, maybe 100 kilometers in diameter or something like that, killing out all life, and basically wiping out the environment in that area. And then when the species come in, there's a new environment. The old balance isn't there anymore, and it's really a ripe ground for new species to develop. So you see all these weird species that start developing on land. In the oceans, there are already weird species like the Anomalocaris, which look pretty weird, and of course the nautiloids that you're all familiar with, that look a little bit like modern day octopuses or squids, but really aren't similar to them at all. More similar to mollusks really. And so we have this glut of new species that developed on the Earth, and we think maybe it was tied down to this collision that happened out in the asteroid belt. But it's hard to tell because that was over 450 million years ago. The rock layers are often 2 miles below the surface. They've just recently been discovered due to maybe gas and oil drilling in some cases, or other kinds of investigations with the other craters. And they're hard to detect. They aren't obvious from the surface at all. But you have 500 million years of deposition of these rock places were down at the bottom of seabeds. They had sediment on them, and they became rock and everything. It's pretty hard to see what the surface of the Earth looked like 500 million years ago. But that's their best bet. Okay, enough of that. I'll get on to the chess now. Well, as promised, there was some chess played last night. And I had a game against Joe Kelly, who I've never played before. In fact, I'd never met him. And the only thing I knew about him was I found one game of his online where he had held John Curto to a draw back in 1999 in a modern defense. And so I looked at a few lines of the modern, sat down to play him, and sure enough, that's what we went into, was a modern defense. So I started with e4, and Joe responded g6. I played d4, bishop g7. Okay, and I had it in my mind that I wanted to get into an Austrian attack against a Pirc variant of, if this would transpose into a Pirc. But at this point, I wasn't sure of the best way to get into it. I was afraid if I played knight c3 here, that he would just continue on with c5. And now it's basically transposed into a hyper-accelerated Sicilian dragon. I could play knight f3, and he would say take, and I could take back. And it's a chess game, but it's a Sicilian. It's not what I was planning to play. I don't know if he would have been happy in that or not. So instead, what I did after bishop g7 was to go ahead and put the third pawn out. But the problem is this leaves me with a pretty extended center, and him with these active hypermodern pieces carping at my center. So he immediately struck back with d5, encouraging me to advance my pawn. I don't want to really trade my e-pawn for his d-pawn. And although that does shut down his bishop for a while, it also leaves me with a kind of a fragile pawn center. I mean, it doesn't look that fragile, but the problem is that if he plays pawn to f6 at some point, attacking e5 at the head of my pawn chain, or c5 attacking at the base of my pawn chain, he can start to tear it apart. And that's exactly what I was worried about over the next several moves. He immediately played c6, and so I was actually sort of glad to see that, because that means that if he, it doesn't take c5 off of the table, but if he decides to go ahead and advance it further to c5, he's wasted a tempo. And tempi are crucial in this sort of game. So I was happy to see that, and now I really only had to worry about the threat of him playing f6 at some point. So I went on and developed. He played his knight through h6, and then it became clear what his idea was. he was planning at some point to move his knight into f5, or possibly his bishop, I suppose, could go there as well. And it might be a little hard to kick out. He could, from f5, you could, exert pressure on my weak d pawn here on weak square on d4. And so I have to, whatever I do has to take that into account. What I decided to do is to develop quickly with my bishop on d3. And now I always have the option to trade off the knight if the knight comes to f5. It might not be advantageous for me, but at least I have that option. And I'm getting ready for quick castle. The idea for me is, I mean, we're really struggling. It's a battle over this f5 square, and I would really like to take control of it, maintain control, because pushing this f pawn is kind of crucial to the possibility of a kingside attack here. Otherwise, a pawn on f4, it looks a little silly. Okay, after I played that, he immediately pinned my knight, which was not a surprise. And when I looked at it, what was a surprise, though, was that the more I looked at it, the less I liked it for white. I had originally planned to, in this position, if he pinned it, to play my bishop to e3. But the problem with bishop to e3 is that he can immediately come in with his knight, attacking my bishop. And although I can retreat it, his queen could put a second attack on the pawn that just became undefended and that d pawn. And there's a few complicated little tactical lines here where I might let him go ahead and take the d pawn, but I decided this was not very good for white. The other, take a look with the engine here. The engine's still happy with it. Okay. Well, I felt uncomfortable. I do have a space advantage. That's to be said, but I feel like I'm starting to give him tactical chances here. If I try to trade off his knight on f5, he can just take back with the bishop now, for example, and it doesn't hurt his pawns at all. The other thing is, in this position that kept me from playing bishop to e3, is that I'd sort of like to have at this point I was thinking about the idea of pushing this b pawn at some point and then playing the bishop out through a3 and taking advantage of this weakened diagonal. That never actually happens in the game, but it was still an idea at this point. So after he pinned me, I decided to attack the bishop right away. And that's because I didn't want to give him time to move the knight in where I couldn't immediately counterattack it. So I took back. So after I took with the queen, he just sort of showed his hand a little that he's interested in playing on the queen side. He played queen b6. And at this point then I was happy that I kept my bishop at home on c1. So, so that it guards this pawn on b2. Okay, I played a move I wanted to play. I'd been thinking about, regardless of, of what his move was, and that's to play my queen to f2. The immediate reason for that, of course, is that it defends that pawn that he just attacked, but it also prepares for the possible move of his knight to f5. If his knight comes into f5 on the next move, say, now I can go ahead and attack it with my pawn. And I've covered these dark squares that the pawn would take, with the exception of this d4 square. But if he takes that, well, first of all, he can't take d4 with the queen, because I would just take the knight, obviously. So his only choice really would be to take it that pawn with the knight, and then my plan was to pin it with the bishop, and this is not a happy situation for him. He obviously can't take the b pawn. Well, is that clear? Yeah, I think that's clear, because I can take his knight. He does get a check in, but it's not a deadly check. I would be able to move my Oh, he picks up the rook. Nope, that's not good. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I should have looked at this a little more carefully. Okay, so maybe that would be okay. With knight takes, just a stockfish says c3 here. Well, I guess I can see that, but he does end up winning the pawn after the knight retreats. I can attack his queen with my bishop, and then his queen would have to move away, or he could push his c pawn. It's a chess game. Stockfish says it's about equal. Okay, so I still like the move queen to f2. It's a flexible square that I put it on. He didn't. This is all academic because he didn't play knight f5. He just simply advanced his e pawn. Now that his bishop has gone through that square, he wanted to strengthen, not only strengthen the center, but most importantly, exert control over this f5 square so that I can't push my pawn. Okay, let's scroll down a bit here. I castled and he castled. And now I have time to get my knight into the game. And coming through c3 was not that tempting because if it had been on c3, it would have been hard for it to do anything with this pawn structure. Instead, coming in through d2, and he makes a developing move, gives me time to get my knight to f3, and now it's really well posted because over here on f3, all of a sudden now I'm really thinking about a kingside attack because my knight can come to g5, my queen can come to h4, and I'm starting to look at the possibilities of a successful kingside attack against his king there. Okay, he counterattacks, which is probably a good idea. At this point, you don't want to just let white have all the play at the one end. But it's a slow attack, and it gives me time to develop my position. I took time out to strengthen my pawn center. So if there's I didn't mind it if he wanted to exchange pawns on d4. I felt that this was okay for me. It gives a kind of a fixed pawn structure in the center. My queen is defending this weak b2 pawn, so my bishop is free to travel. And fairly soon I'm going to get f5 in, maybe g4, and get my pieces rolling. But after c3, he instead closed the position in c4. I have no choice but to retreat my bishop. I don't really want to lock my rook in the corner, so I retreated it to c2. I want to stay on this diagonal where I was influencing the f5 square. Of course, the only bad, well, not the only bad thing, but one of the bad things about this is that it blocks my queen's view of the b2 square, so I'm no longer defending this b2 square with my queen. And in some variations, I might just have to sack that pawn. Okay, now he makes what proves to really to be the losing move, although it's not a very obvious losing move. He plays queen to c6. And the problem is that this is just a little too slow for the oncoming kingside attack. If you run stockfish on this, it's already +3, right? And it's because of this onslaught of the pawns on the kingside. And his idea, after I looked at it for a while, is that at first he moved the queen. I thought maybe his knight was going to come through b6, and then I realized it has nowhere to go. But his idea is to push this b pawn and to attack my pawns on the queen side and play where I don't have my pieces. But meanwhile, I have both bishops, coming down on the king side here. If this pawn gets moving, if the g pawn can help it, all of a sudden I'm going to have a real raging attack. And what was necessary was to stop that attack, or at least to slow it down with a move like f5. Well, I can, and try to stem the tide. Since he went to c6 with the queen instead, that gave me time to play g4, and now it's the position's really dire. I don't think he can keep from losing a piece. He played b5, and when I played f5, he sat there and looked at the position for, close to half an hour. I think he went from 45 minutes down to 15 on his clock. And the reason is there's no way to stop from losing a piece. It's very clearly forced right now. You can look at the various lines. But the principal problem in the position is this knight that's offsides here on h6. It just is stuck over there. And so some of the possibilities, if he takes if he takes my pawn with either the E or the G pawns, let's say, well, what do I show in my notes here? I show G takes. Okay, so if he takes the pawn, what I was planning to do was to push my G pawn, and that knight is trapped. It can't go anywhere. I could also at this point have played, and I did look at this actually, and Stockfish likes it a little better. It's possible I might have played this move. Queen to h4 also goes after the trapped knight. Either way, I win that piece. If he tries to make Luft for the knight by moving his king to the corner, it's not, wait a second, got to make sure it's his move. Okay, if he moves the king to the corner, then obviously the problem is that bishop is trapped on g7 now. So he loses that one. So he has a choice of what piece he wants to lose. And finally, he could do what he did, which is to play f6, making an escape square for the knight. This doesn't work either, though, because I just take on f6. And if he moves the bishop to the corner, for example, then this knight is hanging, and I just take it with my bishop. If he takes the pawn, which is what he did do, with either the bishop or the knight, either way he loses a piece, then I'm able to just go ahead and fork the two pieces. I was a little worried when I first looked at this that his follow-up would be knight to e4, attacking my queen, but I decided that this is okay. I could just trade that off and then take his knight. And then he takes my knight, and I take his bishop, and now I've won a piece. Okay, so that would not be good for him. But what he did do after g5 was surprised me and played knight takes on f5. And at first I thought, I said, geez, this looks bad, because I can just go ahead and take that knight when he has to take back with a pawn. But this would have been a very bad move. This was actually a trap, because he doesn't take back with a pawn. Instead, he attacks my queen with the knight. And even though, whichever way he does it, on e4 or on g4, I can take the knight with my bishop and get it out of harm's way. Well, it's not really out of harm's way. I mean, but temporarily, I'm 2 pieces ahead. I took both of his knights. So when you're temporarily 2 pieces ahead, you figure, well, you can get one of them back, but not both. But it turns out they both get lost, right? Because he takes by the bishop, and now this knight is pinned by the rook, and it's attacked by the pawn. So there's no way to keep from losing it as well. And I move my queen, and he just goes ahead and takes the knight. And this is just this is good for black. He's ahead material, and he's got a freer development. His rook's going to come into the game very fast on f8. It looks very bad. My king position is weak. His king position is solid. In all the important ways, his position is better. And not surprisingly, Stockfish says he's a couple points ahead in this position. So fortunately, I did see that, and instead of taking that knight on f5, I went ahead and, in this position, instead of taking knight on f5, I went ahead and took the knight on f6. And I was, this wasn't my favorite at first, because I thought maybe he'd take back with the rook. But if he takes back with the rook, I have bishop g5, immediately forcing the rook to retreat and gaining a move in development. So that's not so hot. Instead, he takes with the bishop, which I think is the right move. So after that, I went ahead and traded that knight off. He took back with the e pawn. I thought g pawn was a possibility, but that weakens his king further, although it also opens up a corridor to my king. This allows me to play bishop to h6, and the reason I did that was to Well, it was to get the, to get him, to encourage him to do what he did, which is to move the rook to e8. The other possibility would have been to play rook to f7. If he did that, then that rook on f7, let's say he did move that, then I would, that's not what I was going to do. I was going to play bishop to f4 and then be threatening knight e5, forking the queen and the rook. So, and he'd have to take it. So it's, or maybe a move later, I might have played rook e1 first, supporting this move. But the point is that the rook is not well placed on f7 because it's on a square now where it can be easily forked by a knight on e5, forked with the queen. So he went to e8. And the problem with going to e8, though, is this just lets me to trade down into one endgame. If I play rook e1, there's really nothing for him to do. He doesn't want to give me the file. He goes ahead and keeps attacking on the queen side. If I trade off a pair of rooks, then I waste a move, or spend a move, invest a move, getting ready to trade off another pair of rooks. And that gives him a move to advance his queen side, but it's just not fast enough. I trade off that rook. He has to take back. And now I threaten to either trade off queens or be happy if he just got off the e-file and gave it to my queen, where I could threaten to penetrate with my queen and also support knight e5 and so on. So he made a good move here. I sort of thought he was going to trade queens, but he played queen e4, which actually made me think twice about trading queens because I didn't want to give him such a strong protected passed pawn. But then when I looked at the endgame, I decided it was actually winning for white, so I went ahead and did that. He took back, and the problem is that my knight's immediately under attack, and I have to be a little careful here. What I did was to play it to d2, realizing that he has some, I had to look at some sacrificial possibilities here. So this e-pawn could be fast. He could at some point take on d4 and get a pawn moving quickly over here, like his c pawn or his b pawn moving very quickly. And finally, as if that isn't enough, the other threat he has is to play this pawn to g4, trapping my bishop, and then bringing the king over on the white squares to round up my bishop. But that's a little slow because he'd have to move his bishop back to guard this f8 square, which would be the escape route for my bishop. If worst comes to worst, too, I can always pull the maneuver of pushing my h-pawn after he advances his g-pawn, and that would allow me to get my bishop out, possibly at the expense of a pawn, and although it would ruin his pawn structure. Anyhow, that's off to the future. A little bit more analysis than you need right here. What he did was to trade off pawns immediately, and now he went ahead and made that trapping move for my bishop. Just to show you what happens if he does go ahead and take this pawn, I could take back, and he would come forward. My knight would be driven somewhere. I think a natural square would be to go to c4. And in this position, you can see that all of a sudden now my bishop is controlling all these dark squares, and there's no way for him to easily keep my bishop out. And I'm going to have time to get my bishop back to c1 and move my king up to stop the pawns. So he didn't go in for that line. And instead, he trapped my bishop, or threatens to trap my bishop. But meanwhile, my knight is going to do a lot of damage to his weak pawns. He decided to hang on to the a-pawn. Maybe he should have brought his king out instead at this point and just let me go ahead and diddle around on the queen side if I wanted to. But those pawns of mine that are passed are going to get dangerous as well. Instead, he chose to protect that pawn. Let me advance my cursor there, and that gave me time to play knight d6. And of course, the nice thing about that is that it controls these squares, and the bishop controls those squares, so the king is trapped. And meanwhile, this pawn is under attack, and if he pushes it, this pawn is under attack. So this is at this point, this is really lost for black. I don't know what the analysis is. +6 or so, yeah, I believe it. He played, I should also mention, because he spent so much time on that one move, trying to avoid losing a piece somehow, or figuring out the best way to lose the piece, if there could be such a thing. He was down to very little time. Near the end of the game here, he only had a minute and a half or 2 minutes, and was playing quite rapidly. So it's not very high quality. I'll just go through the last few moves. He played g4. I took. He took back. That let me take the e-pawn. His bishop moves. And now my bishop threatens to trade his off. If he moves, my knight can come in on f6 check. And unless he trades it off, it's going to take this pawn on the light square. I mean, there's just no happiness in Mudville here. So he trades off my bishop. But now that knight, the fact that I have the knight and nothing but weak pawns on his side and strong pawns means that you just can't hold this endgame. He played on through inertia for another move or two, got his king forward. And then after this move, while I was thinking about which square to advance my king to, g2 or probably f2 would be better, he resigned. So it was a fun game. It turned out that we won on the first board. Well, I'll show the results with a little bit of video magic afterward. But Brett won, and Brett Kildall won, and also Mike Camiso won. We drew the bottom 2 boards, and we had 2 losses. But we ended up winning last night's first match. It's kind of a home and away match. We won that 4-3, and we'll have the counter match with colors reversed next Sunday. And hopefully I'll bring that game to you as well. So, it's Roger Capello signing off from my week at the club. Bye-bye.